All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Drawing X Live with me, Jedidiah Dore. I am the instructor for this class today. And today's class, we're going to be working, I called it Painterly Pastels. We're going to be working with pastels, mostly dry pastels or chalk pastels or soft pastels. I don't recommend using oil pastels because we want to be able to basically rub and smear and do all kinds of fun things with the pastels. So hopefully you have the more soft and powdery, sort of chalky pastels, if you will. So we're going to be learning the great benefits of pastels and for both drawing and coloring. And we're going to focus on applying the pastels and utilizing both a direct method along with blending tools. And that's going to create some really vibrant illustration. The thing that I love about pastels is really how incredibly vibrant the color is. It's just painterly. It's really essentially a drawing, luminous, and then you can manipulate it very similar to how you would with a painting. That's what makes it great. If you don't have all the tools, that's okay. Let's go over that just very quickly so I can show you what I'm going to be using. But if you don't have them, that's totally okay. You can use anything you want, and you can kind of, make it adjustment. You can make the adjustment if you want and see what interesting things happen when you do that, right? So here's my desktop here. I've got some watercolor paper. This is an intense bright white um, paper. It's approximately 12 by 16. It's a light fast paper. I like to use it because it's smooth. It's a hot press paper. And some of the tools, I don't know if I'm going to use all of them, but I'm going to use my watercolors, right? And this is just to create a wash. This is what we're going to do first. So if you have watercolors, even wash you can use just a light wash in the background to just kind of fill up some of this white canvas or this white paper, if you will, and just to kind of set the tone and create a nice backdrop. I have some pastels here, beautiful pastels, a full range of pastels. And these are, like I said, they're very chalky. They rub and they smear. So that's what I prefer for today. I also have some pen my blending stumps. If you have blending stumps, they're really just rolled paper. You see them at any art store, art supply store, and they come in different sizes. You can also use a Q-tip. You can use just a rolled up piece of paper. You can use your finger. Sometimes I use my finger. It's more precise, actually. But what I love about these is that they come in different kind of shapes, so they have the triangular ones for more refined smudging and blending, and then they have the square ones. So I'm going to go ahead and use these to do that. And they also come with like these powdery sort of pastels that almost look like little makeup like containers, and then the drawing it, and then you smear it on the paper and it applies almost like you're drawing with the tool. And that's essentially it. I have my water, and so I'm ready to go. And we have this this really nice reference. Isn't that a great reference? We have the bird reference. So if you are attending if you signed up for our Drawing X Live classes on our website, you can get the resources and the resources guide and see the reference. Right. So the very first step is I want to create a nice wash, just sort of as a backdrop, and that's going to create a nice mood for our watercolor for the whole illustration. Now, this is really your choice. It doesn't have to be the exact color that you see, whether you're on location or you're looking at a reference and working at the studio. It doesn't have to be exactly right. I'm just going to pick a kind of general color, and it looks like maybe an umber or sienna or a light brown, basically, or maybe a light green. There's a little bit of pink in there too. So any one of those I think would be great. but you can just, you can use any kind of color you want. In fact, I changed my mind. I think I want to do blue. So if you just 1 second, I'm going to grab my brushes just over here, just out of reach. I knew it was something, but there we go. There's our brushes. So I have these two brushes here I can use to kind of create brown color, right? And that's going to be really helpful. So I have my water, and I'm just going to use a light blue, maybe with just a little bit of color in it, just so that it pushes back and it creates a little bit of a tone, right? So I'm going to put these out of the way for us. Just use a wet kind of application. I know it's kind of obvious because it's watercolor, but you can use what's called a wet or dry. Dry is basically you're just using less water and you're using more pigment or watercolor. And I'm just gonna wet the palette here, the canvas, and the paper, just to create a nice little wash. And this is why it's a good idea to use a watercolor paper or something heavy duty so that the paper doesn't buckle, or any kind of wet media paper, because it will kind of buckle on you and kind of warp when you apply the water. But not too much, just you start to see the gloss of the water there. And I'm just going to create a little bit of a wash here. Oh, there we go. It's kind of backwards. And let's see. I want a nice, I'm going to create maybe two different washes, two different blues, right? And I love to mix my pigments. I don't like to use it straight from the tube or the palette, because I like to create my own colors, and I like watercolor sets that enable me to do that and have a good range of color and good choices, good color choices in the palette. That's a little bit purple, but I like those two colors there, right? So now that I have the right color, I want to kind of tone it down, add a little bit of water so that it's not too rich. It's not too dark, right? And now it's still a little bit wet. You can kind of see that it's still a little bit wet. And I'm just going to apply this color, just not really thinking about rhyme or reason, just enjoying applying this color in the background. I might start to think about, if you are thinking about the composition, where, for example, the birds are going to be and where that branch is going to be. So you might want to consider that. But for now, I'm just sort of setting a mood, kind of a backdrop to soften up and color that white background to give us a little bit more color. Doesn't that look nice already, right? And if you want, you can add a little bit more pigment, because you can see there's a little bit more there. And I'm not going to add any more water because I don't want it to get too washed. So I might add just a little bit more here and there. When you're doing this, just have fun with it. Don't think too much about where things are going to go and how things are going to look, because there are going to be lots and lots of layers that we're going to put on top of this beautiful background. So already it's very interesting, right? It's already starting to happen. Interesting things are already starting to happen, right? And if you want, right, I recommend, by the way, if you're using watercolor, to let things dry and let things settle. But if you're confident, you can add a few other colors. Try not to get it too muddy, because that's what happens when you start applying different colors too quickly. The colors will start to mushroom or start to blossom into one another, and starts to get a little bit muddy, right? So I want to add just some touches of green. So let's add just a little bit of green. And you don't have to use this exact same color palette I'm using. Feel free to kind of explore and be curious and use your own color palette and see what happens. I'm going to get really uh, I'm going to start to use some different colors here and just kind of imagine what's what I can do to kind of change things and make it a little bit more interesting, right? So just applying different shades of green, for example, just for different areas. You can see because it's still a little bit wet, right? It has a nice, very soft feel to it. It's easy to blend the colors. So I'm going to be careful not to do too much to it because I don't want it to be too muddy, right? So that feels pretty good. I like that. Um, that's kind of what I was imagining. I could use a little bit more color. Let me just curl this the other way because I didn't tape it down. Right, so that's looking good. See how that looks? It's already very dreamy. It's got a nice feel to it. All right, so let that set for a minute. And while that's kind of hanging out and just getting all nice and ready for us, I have my rag here and I have some napkins and tissues. So if you want to speed up the process a little bit, you can use a paper towel, you can use a rag to kind of wipe it down and it'll soften up those colors. It'll dry it much, much quicker. The only thing is you have to consider that when you do that, it does pick up a significant amount of water if it's still a little bit wet, right? So, but that's actually an interesting thing because I'll give you an example. You can use it as a kind of mark making or interesting way to create some texture with the washes. So for example, if I'm going to pat this area dry here, you'll notice that it creates some interesting textures, right? Right. So there's some branches and twigs that kind of come up, right? So it can be really spontaneous with it. And it picks up some of the pigment. And sometimes if you push hard enough, it'll pick up quite a bit of it. And it creates some really interesting textures, right? So that's something you can try and kind of experiment with while it's drying. So it's almost there, right? So while that's going and getting happy, I'm going to get my pastels ready, right? So you can draw right directly with the pastels if you want, because keep this in mind, it's very, very forgiving, right? And that just means that you can add, you can kind of subtract, you can add highlights and contrast and darks. So it's very forgiving if you want to go straight into just using the pastels. If you want to case in the composition, if you want to block it in a little bit, you got a couple of choices here to draw with your blending tool, for example, or you can draw directly with the pastel and then just kind of rub it. Another thing that you can do is you can draw with some pencils, right? So if you brought some colored pencils, if you have any colored pencils, just pick one that's kind of a medium color. You can pick like a light brown or a light yellow, something that does register on the page. Let's choose, I'm going to choose either a purple or a light green. So these two ChromaFlow pencils I'm using is a lilac and this one is foliage, right? So it's basically a medium green and a purple, right? So I'm going to use these two to draw in our composition, right? I think it's a good kind of average color. It's a nice natural looking color too. It's not too vibrant, but if you want to change the colors, you're free to do so. I think it'd be interesting to really just be liberal with the color and see what happens. All right, nice and sharpened, right? Okay. So I'm going to start with, let's go ahead and put the branch in because I think that's important for establishing where and how, like, or how the composition is going to look for us. I'm imagining it's going to be right about a third of the way from the bottom. I don't want to elongate it too much. I want to make sure we have enough time to really get to some finish line when we get to towards the end of the class. So I'm going to keep it a little bit smaller and keep it more contained in the center of the composition. So there's still some areas where it's still a little bit wet. So I'm going to take my napkin, or actually I have my rag here. That's probably a lot better. And I'm just going to pat it gently, just really light, because you can see it's not picking up any more of the color because it's dry, almost dry. I think that's really interesting. Isn't that neat that we created that kind of ghosted image with the tissue? That's something you can really investigate, isn't it? Right. I'm always discovering, no matter how many years, no matter how long I draw and paint, it's just a new discovery. There's always something that happens that is pretty surprising. That's pretty good, right? Obviously, if we're outside, this dries even quicker. It literally only takes a few seconds, right? Okay, pretty good. Let's see how that looks for now. Let's see if the pencil will, yeah, pretty good. Let's try the purple. I think the purple's probably better for us to use, right? So just think of it like, if you want, you can kind of draw a center line, right? But if you're confident to draw the contour line of that branch, meaning the outside edge of the branch, go ahead and put it right in, right? And remember, these pastels are really opaque. You'll see when we apply them, they'll sit right on top, comfortably right on top of the watercolor wash and the drawing that we have, right? It's very vibrant. So don't be afraid to just, put the drawing just right in there. And I'm just going to follow the edge, almost like I'm taking a walk right along the outside edge of that branch, right? You could see I'm just following along and just right to the end there. That's pretty good size. I'm going to condense it a little bit for us, okay? Go. And if you want, you can kind of imagine the edge of it, just so that you give yourself a reference to where the edge of the composition falls. And now let's draw the top contour line, right? Comes up. There's a nice angle that just kind of angles up and then down. And now I'm going to draw that one branch that's broken, that's pointing up at kind of at a 30-degree angle here. And then just back down, just like that, right? And if you want to see a little clearer, just add a little bit more, right? Because like I said, when you add those pastels, they will definitely cover any of these lines, the majority of these lines, depending on how much pastels you add to it, right? So that's looking pretty good. I like that. And then if you want to add some details, that's probably not a bad idea, right? We can draw the crown of this kind of branch that was starting to grow. We can draw some of the larger shapes and contours, for example, like how this curls around, like so, because we want to draw it cylindrical because that's the shape of it. So we imply that shape. And then this branch here is interesting, creates this beautiful kind of lines that curl around, right? And some people like to do this. They like to designate where some of the shadows and lights and darks might be. So for example, if you wanted to designate an area at the bottom, because that's where most of the dark tones will be, the dark colors will be at the bottom, you can kind of do that if you want. It's not a bad idea as well. So I see some people doing that. And then some of the highlights too, if you wanted. So you can go as far as you want with this pencil drawing, but I recommend if we're going to work, you're working with pastels, to just go ahead and just block in the largest shapes that you see that way. It's for composition. All right, so let's add the birds. I wonder if we can add any green now. That's pretty light. So I'm going to go on with this purple because it's working for me. Right. This green is a nice color, but it's a little bit too light, and I'm not pushing that hard anyway with the pencil, but I just want to make sure that you guys can see these two birds here that we're going to draw. So first things first, to draw the body of it because it's really just an oval, right? So no worries, no worries at all. And like I said, everything can be so adjustable because it's so easy to fix it, and it's so forgiving when you're working with pastels. So I'm just drawing some of the larger shapes and circles and ovals that I'm seeing, right? That's a pretty good size for the body. If you want to enlarge it a little bit, you're welcome to. So we might extend it out a little bit, and then just a head, like that. That's a beautiful shape. Okay, just really just another oval, almost egg shape, and then draw the back side of it coming down like so. And then the beak, right? Just a little triangle, just like that. And then we have the legs. That's just a couple of straight lines, really, right? Easy. No big deal. I maybe draw some of the feathers there just for reference. There we go. So we got one. Let's add, looks like his crest, the crest of the birds. It's so pretty, it's so beautiful, the colors. All right, so that's pretty good. Now I'm going to move this one bird a little bit closer, right? Just so that they're paired up even better, right? So I'm going to move the composition slightly to the right so that they're closer together, right? So I would say the beak would be about right here. And that's going to make, in my opinion, an interesting composition as well. So just let's draw a round head here, approximately the size of the head is good, right? Very similar to the other bird, about the height of it. And that's going to make it easy for you to kind of case in where the rest of it lands, right? And then the body is just an oval, right? It's almost a football shape. So let's just draw an oval, just a nice simple oval, just like that, kind of overlapping, right? Maybe a little bit lower so that the legs aren't too long. And like I said, you can make adjustments along the way, like you can make the top of this trunk a little bit wider so that it's not so tall. The bird isn't so tall. And then the tail just goes almost straight back, almost the same length as the body. And then that's when you can kind of drop in some other shapes there, like the green, the top of the green, and that beautiful kind of royal purple shape there. And then the legs, just they both are parallel, right? It's almost midway in the body, just like that. Okay, and last but not least, the beak. It's just triangle. It's kind of curving down, right? There we go. Very nice. And just like that, look at that. That's interesting, right? It's almost like they're communicating directly with each other. And you can kind of adjust the contour line later on, really, because we can do that with our pastels if we want. And anything else you want to add, you can add more branches. You can add other branches, kind of framing them if you want. And you can make your adjustments here. For example, I want this branch to be a little bit taller and stick out a little bit more. So that way it's in proportion, right? And that, I think I'm happy with that. I like that. And maybe just one more adjustment on the width on the bottom. And there we go. That's looking good. Okay. So we've established that backdrop. It's really helping us really create a nice mood and start of the drawing. We've cased in the composition here with the birds and the branch. And so far, pretty easy, right? So let's get right to it. You have a choice here. You can kind of add some color to the background, right? Because I'll show you for a second. Let's use this color, for example, right? So this is kind of umber kind of color, and let's add it right here. And I'm just going to apply it this way, right? It's a nice touch of it. And I can kind of rub it with my hand, or I can use this blending stick, right, to create an interesting sort of tone, right? And you can go right into things. You can kind of bump into where your drawing is, because remember, I'll show you why you don't have to worry about being so careful with them and so being so precise. And why I always say the pastels always often feel like painting, because it's very opaque and very forgiving as far as where you want to manipulate it, where you kind of want to move the color and push the color, right? So we have this nice tone right there. Now, if we added green, I'll show you. If we added any kind of green, let's go with just a nice normal or straight green, just a pure green. I can just add it right on top of there, and look how it sits right on top of that color, right? So it's it's just so nice that it just sits on top of any color that you apply. And look at how that watercolor just comes through still. So I think that's interesting. And of course, if you blend it enough, eventually it does mute the color, loses a little bit more of its vibrancy, but you don't have to do it that much. And so that's why it's very painterly. You can kind of manipulate it and soften it and push it around. But you can see how each color just sits on top, right? So you can keep it refined, you can keep it very sharp in contrast, or you can kind of brush it away and keep it a little bit painterly, right? So I like what I'm doing here. So let's keep going. Let's go ahead and put in the background for a bit and just kind of set a mood, because I love how this is turning out so far. So I'm going to put this down for a second, and I'm just going to choose a couple of different browns, maybe some cool browns and some warm browns. So for now, let's choose some cooler sort of shades of brown, right? And apply that first. And some of these are a little bit close in color, they're a little bit dark. So I want to get a little bit of a range of color there. So I like these colors here. That's nice and cool. So these three here are looking good, right? Okay. And then we can add some of the warmer colors afterwards. So first, it's up to you if you want to go with darker colors first or lighter color first. Because like I said, if you add any kind of dark color, for example, if I add this dark shade here, right, you can see how if you add any light color, it just sits right on top of that nicely, right? So you can go in any kind of order, really. But I think what I want to do is I do want to add some darker tones first, right? And I just want to play around with it. I don't want to get too precise. Just kind of feel it out and see where you want to add some things and kind of highlight some things. If you want to frame some of the subjects, if you want to add contrast to them, you want to add some darker tones behind them, for example, maybe behind some of the tree stumps, that kind of thing. That's always interesting. So I want to add just a few areas here of dark brown. And this is why you can see you can go right into just coloring straight into it, right? But it's pretty helpful, isn't it, to have the drawing there, just in case in the drawing. Right. I love the colors here, the potential for the colors that we're seeing. There's so many things we can do. You can paint a more impressionistic style of illustration or painting. You can do more abstracted, and you can do a more refined, more realistic portrait, for example, or painting. And that's the interesting thing with pastels is it's a little bit hard to decide if it's a painting or a drawing. I mean, technically it's more of a drawing because the way we're applying it into dry medium, but it does feel very painterly, right? And interestingly, I'll show you. If you use just a napkin, it creates different marks, right? So here's what a napkin, we can kind of spread it around a little bit and create different textures. You can kind of hear the sound it makes, and that's going to give you different types of marks, right? For example, you can use your finger. I love to get messy. I get messy every time I draw and paint. So you can use your finger. And if it's a very, very soft pastel, it's going to be easier for you to rub it. But that is pretty neat the way you can kind of manipulate and push it around and soften it up with your finger. But I think the easiest if you have any kind of blending stump, for example. I'm going to wipe off just a little bit of the color. And I'm just going to soften up the edges here. Like I said, you can use a Q-tip, you can use your finger, you can use a blending stump. Lots of things that you can use. I won't smear the whole thing because I like the texture that I'm seeing in some places, right? And just using blending, sit on the edge, right? Right, see, you can create different kind of marks with it. You can draw with it. I feel like we're painting. This is so fun because it's just like we're painting with this dry medium. It's almost like it's a cross perfect mixture of those two types of applications, really. So I like some of the texture that I'm seeing with the paper showing through. So I'm gonna leave a bit of that alone. I'm gonna leave a little bit of it alone and showing so that way I don't completely rub it out or smudge it away. Just kind of soften it up a little bit. Right? And if you wanted to add some of the branches, for example, just kind of growing upwards and pointing towards the top of the composition, you can do that now. Because that can, anything that you do now can always be adjusted. It can always be refined. Happy with that. I like where this is going. I want to push this a little bit closer to our branch so it creates a nice silhouette. Right, so I'm going to use the edge of it just to kind of refine that more. Right. Okay. Now that looks pretty good. I'm going to add now some of the lighter colors that I chose for the majority of this background. So we have this slightly warmer brown. Let's see if it shows up. Yeah, it's pretty good. So I'm going to use that to create some different marks and different colors. And here you can just begin to refine the edges of things, like where the bird is and where the edge of the branch might be, right? So that way you don't lose track of where it is, where the composition is. So here you can draw directly with the pastel and start to case in further and further the shape of some of the subjects here that we have right in the foreground, the birds. I'm just drawing right along the outside of it, just like that, right? So I don't lose the shape here. And it's not a bad idea to draw on the birds too, draw on the birds first. So that would be a good reason to do that. peek here. You good? Okay. And the tail goes further out like so. All right. And here's where, a finer tip might come in handy. If I don't lose the tip, there we go. And just point it straight up so that way we can push that pastel chalk or powder where we want it to go and still keep that nice contour line around it. Right? And this is where we're now softening up the edges and starting to bring it alive, the whole piece, the whole thing alive. And really just think about it and think of it in layers, no really not unlike painting where you're working with glazes or where you're painting with watercolor or gouache. You're just using layers and layers. And I think the trick, if there's any trick to pastel, or really the smart way to use it, is to just be patient with it and know that it's a process and it's worth that process and really worth building up the art that way, because it's so worth your while to be patient and take your time. And that's a great way to learn about the medium as well. Right? I'm just kind of softening things up here because the background really isn't the star of the show, although we're already creating a really interesting background, I feel like. There we go. That's looking good, right? It's looking interesting. And like I said, you can use this to kind of you kind of pick up some of the pigment. For example, you can draw a line with it. You can kind of smudge the edge of it, for example, and pick up a little bit. Or you can probably do this with the blending step as well, is you can just rub the pastel with it, the tip of it, and just draw with it, right? And create a nice tone that way, right? But I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add a line there. You can use blue, you can use brown, really just a darker color to create some contrast, a bit of contrast, so that you refine the edge of this branch. It also feels a little bit like sculpting. You're kind of chiseling away, you're kind of adding and subtracting shapes and creating textures and just kind of working with it along the way. And each layer and each level or each step is just makes it different. Okay, put these up here. And here's where I won't smudge it too much, but I do want to just soften up that edge just enough so you can still see the contour line, but in blending it enough so that it looks more natural and smooth. Right? Just kind of in matching with everything else that we've done in that background. And move this up a little bit. There we go. So far, so good. We're moving right along. My gosh. The time just flies by whenever we have class here at dxlive, because I tell you, it's so fun to sit here and have class with you and just learn things along with you and experiment with all kinds of mediums and different techniques. The time just literally flies by. So let's pause here for a second after I just kind of get happy about where we are. I think that makes me happy. I think I'm feeling good about where this is at. You can see I'm just kind of softening up where I feel like softening up some of the color here. And then of course, if you wanted, that's the dark and medium. When you add some of the lighter colors, like this is just a light yellow, light brown, very light kind of yellow. You can see what happens when you start to add some of those highlights in there. It creates very, very interesting marks. And I love marks like this because it's, it's interesting. It's almost like it's light reflecting. And here's where we can start to add some detail to the drawing. And it really helps it. So you can kind of play around with that, right? So you can see each layer makes sense for the other. It's almost like they're just working together and they're in collaboration with each other. It's just a draw really, because it feels like you're forming too much of a mess. And pause here for a minute or two. If you have a question or just want to comment and see how things are going, just wondering, go ahead and raise your hand in the chat and feel free to comment or ask a question, and hopefully I can answer them. And also don't feel like you have to keep pace with my drawing speed or the way I'm as quick or as keeping it pace with how fast I'm going. You can go your own pace. You can go as slow as you want, because remember, you can watch the video again and take your time. All right, so no comments and questions. Everybody's being very studious, very good. All right, so let's go ahead and go right into the branch and the birds. I think that's really important because I think I want to make sure that we have the star of the show. I'm happy with the background. We can do a little bit more, but I want to make sure that we leave ourselves enough time to start drawing in the birds, right? So a couple of choices we have. We can go ahead and detail the birds with some pencil. But I think it would be smart to just go ahead and go right in and draw with the pastels, because I think that's going to make for a nice, very cohesive drawing, especially that we have this beautiful background. So let's choose our darks. I like to use a more natural color for darks. I like to use, for example, instead of that black, I'm going to use this midnight blue or royal blue. Let's see, there's a yellow there. It's beautiful, bright yellow. There's orange. That other bird, both of them have that yellow and orange underbelly, and then we have the purples there, and then a little bit of blue go with that. So what I'm doing, I'm just choosing, designating colors, and leave the white, the darkest color and lightest color for last, right? Because you can draw on top of that, you can add that last for any kind of highlights, right? So I'm just going to set the white aside here because that's obvious. And then we have some greens. So let's get some of the greens here. There's a light green and dark green, and it's pretty warm, very tropical kind of green. So I'm going to choose some greens that are a little bit warmer, and that's looking pretty good. And of course, there's a red for the bird on the left, right? And if we wanted to add just a few highlights, just some pink, right? So that's what I'm going to do. This is my color range here for the birds. Let's start with the bird on the left, and let's add these greens first, right? And let's set these aside here for a second. I'm just going to keep these here to the left. And I'm just going to start with the lightest green, right? And if you want to add, there's yellow red on the top here. So I'm going to start with the lightest green and just kind of add it just like that. And remember, it's okay if it goes past your drawing line, because your contour line, because you can always add and subtract and kind of refine the edge later on, right? So I'm going to add that green right there. boy, that drawing is really helping us contain it. It's really helping us know where some of the color is. Right? And I'm just going to clean my blending stick, blending pen, pencil, or brush, whatever you want to call it, sponge. If you're using a blending stump, that's just as good. I'm just going to soften up that green, right? Because it's really going to be underneath everything, so it doesn't need to be that dark or that vibrant. And then I'm going to choose the medium green now, right? Actually, let's go ahead, since we have it in hand, let's add the green here to the right. And you don't have to smudge all of it because you do want it to have some kind of contrast, so it creates that shape. So I won't soften up all of this. Okay, same thing here, just a little bit, just like that. And now we have the medium green, and it's kind of pushing back towards the tail feathers here, and it gets a little bit more intense, more pure green as we get to the tail. And then the darkest green right at the bottom, and a little bit of texture, so I might leave that alone a little bit and might not rub as much of this or blend as much of it into the drawing. I might leave most of it alone. That's really interesting. So just being very careful, just being a little bit more precise about where I want to blend it. Maybe blend it towards the front so that I don't smudge those really nice textures that I have in there. Just like that, right? Same thing with this bird here. Let's refine the shape of it with the medium green. The outside of it, just like that. And then the dark green, it's towards the bottom and the inside, which is convenient because that gives us a nice kind of contour to shape the bird perfectly. Just kind of moving its way around to the crown and around the neck, just like that. Very subtle. So just keep it nice and light if you can. And you know, work from, rather than think of it as colors, but think of it as values or different intensity of color, from light to medium to dark in intensity, right? And if you want, it's probably a good idea because it does get very powdery, because that's really the character of pastels, is that you can get a lot of powder on your paper. So I'm gonna lift my paper here and just do this one, and then blowing right here next to my rag, and just shape the paper. And there we go. That gets rid of, very nice way, all of the loose powder that's on top of the paper. That's better than just blowing it all over the place. So do that every once in a while, because it does get powdery on top. It does start to layer. All right, so let's go with the purples. So I have these two purples here. I have a royal purple and a midnight blue. So I think what I want to do is add the blue first. It's in the back of this round part here, almost the bottom. Makes up the crest. And just draw the edge of it like that.